All right, so we're taking a deep dive today, and this one's a doozy. It's about this guy, Avro Manhattan. And at first glance, you think, okay, aristocrat, an artist, sounds pretty straightforward, right? But then you dig a little deeper.
And then you get to the part where he's this, well, relentless critic of the Catholic Church, writing about, let's just say, the church's not so holy side, particularly in global
Right,
affairs.
it's like, where did that come from? And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're talking about a guy born, get this, Teofilo Lucifero Gardini, an Italian baron to Jewish parents.
Talk about a complex heritage right from the start.
Seriously. And then he has to flee Italy for, get this, opposing Mussolini.
It really makes you wonder how those early experiences, the privilege, the exile, shaped his view of, well, everything, especially his view of authority, the Catholic Church. You can almost see the connection.
Oh, absolutely. It's like he saw firsthand the dangers of unchecked power. Maybe that's where some of his later critiques of the church's influence come from. But hold on, he was also involved in British propaganda during World War II.
Yeah, during the war, he was working on a radio station broadcasting into Nazi-occupied Europe.
Wow, talk about a front row seat to some of the biggest conflicts of the 20th century.
Right. It really puts his later writings into perspective.
So we've got this like really complex character, right? And he clearly wasn't afraid of controversy. But what was his central issue with the Catholic Church? I mean, what was the driving force behind his like decades of criticism?
At the heart of it, Manhattan believed the Catholic Church was hypocritical, deeply so, more interested in power and influence than actually upholding its own teachings.
So kind of a rules for thee but not for me situation.
Exactly. And he used their actions throughout history, particularly during World War II, as evidence.
And this is where that book, The Vatican's Holocaust, comes in, right? I'm seeing some strong opinions about that one.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. It's a provocative title, for sure. And the book itself doesn't hold back. He really goes into the Vatican's relationship with regimes like Nazi Germany, the independent state of Croatia, accusing them of complicity in atrocities, even using the word participation.
Wow, didn't pull any punches. But did he have the evidence to back it up? Was this like a common view at the time, or was he considered an outlier?
That's where things get really interesting and where I think understanding the context is so important, because while some of his claims are based on historical events, his interpretations, well, they were and still are heavily debated.
So not everyone agreed with him.
Not at all. A lot of historians and scholars, even back then, accused him of, cherry-picking evidence, maybe even twisting it a bit to fit his narrative.
So he was definitely stirring the pot, maybe even playing a bit of an ideological chess game to make his point.
He definitely knew how to get people talking.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole thing even wilder. Despite being, really anti-Christian, his work actually resonated with certain Protestant groups.
Wait, really? It seems kind of contradictory, right?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You've got these Protestant groups, some of them quite conservative, embracing the work of someone who ultimately wanted to see Christianity gone, totally replaced.
It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Exactly. It shows just how complex these religious alliances can be. Shared enemies make for strange bedfellows, even if it means overlooking some fundamental differences in belief. Take the Canadian Orange Lodge, for example.
The Orange Lodge.
They're a Protestant fraternal organization, very influential, especially in Canada. And they were, and still are, very much against Catholic influence in public life. They saw Manhattan as this, shared enemy, a powerful voice against an institution they already opposed.
So Manhattan tapped into this pre-existing tension, this historical mistrust, even if his end goal was way more radical than, say, what the Orange Lodge probably wanted.
Right. And it speaks to his cunning, I think, this ability to frame his arguments in a way that resonated with specific audiences, even if those audiences didn't fully grasp it or maybe even agree with his full vision.
He was playing 3D chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
Exactly. And it makes figuring out his true intentions, his motivations, even more challenging. Was he really this crusader for truth as he saw it? Or was there a more, let's say, strategic element to his work? Was he using history to push a specific agenda?
Or maybe, and this is where it gets really interesting, a bit of both.
Now, that is the million-dollar question.
So, okay, we've got this picture of Manhattan, right? Super cunning, playing this high-stakes chess game with ideas, using history to challenge the Catholic Church. But what was he actually trying to achieve? What was the end game here?
Well, he wasn't just trying to critique, that's for sure. He actually had a vision for the future. And it was, well, it was a pretty radical one.
Oh, lay it on me. What kind of future did this guy envision?
He actually called it a New World Order.
Okay, now we're talking New World Order. That sounds pretty intense. So what did that look like in his mind?
Imagine a world without the influence of organized religion.
Whoa, really? Gone completely.
Especially the Catholic Church. He was really big on secularism, like total separation of church and state. But he took it even further, thinking about it on a global scale.
So no more popes and presidents shaking hands, no more religious leaders weighing in on, like, global issues.
Exactly. He was convinced that the only way to real progress, like true justice and equality, was to take religion out of the equation completely. He thought reason and science should be our guiding principles, not religious dogma.
So instead of faith, he puts his trust in logic and science and things you can, like, measure and prove.
Exactly. And not just for like individual governments, but for how nations interact with each other too. He was all about globalism, countries cooperating based on shared human values, reason, not religious differences.
Okay, I have to say, some of this sounds strangely familiar. Like, we're still having these debates today, right? The role of religion in society, globalization.
That's what's so fascinating about studying someone like Manhattan. These ideas that might have sounded totally out there decades ago, well, they're part of the mainstream conversation now. Think about it. The influence of science and technology in our lives, it's huge. In some ways, it's like he predicted this shift, this move away from traditional sources of authority.
It makes you wonder, though, was he really a visionary, seeing the future? Or was he just really good at picking up on what was already happening? Like anxieties about power, about change, about the future itself.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like, did he shape the future with his ideas, or was he shaped by forces already at play? It's probably a bit of both, to be honest. But what's undeniable is that he had this uncanny ability to tap into those anxieties, to articulate them in a way that resonated with a certain audience, even if it meant ruffling some feathers along the way.
And that kind of takes us back to that Antichrist label some people slapped on him. I know we touched on it before, but it's quite the comparison. So what do you make of it? And don't worry, I'm not going to make you put on your theologian hat or anything.
No worries there. It's definitely a loaded term and not meant literally, of course. But I think it speaks to this deep-seated fear that some people had about Manhattan and how he operated.
Like, even if we take his goals at face value, exposing hypocrisy, pushing for a better world, maybe it was more about his methods that rubbed people the wrong way, like the manipulation, the way he presented some historical events.
Right. He was very effective, at least in the short term, at exploiting those existing tensions, using them to get his message across. And for some, that was deeply unsettling.
It does make you think twice, right? Not just about what he was saying, but why he was saying it. And, who was really benefiting from his, let's call it, historical activism.
And that's where his story becomes a cautionary tale, I think. He reminds us that history is rarely black and white. Even the people who position themselves as the good guys, the ones fighting for truth and progress, well, they can still have agendas that might not align with our own.
It's easy to get swept up in someone's message, their charisma, without stopping to think about the potential consequences or, questioning their motives.
That's right. And that's a really important lesson, especially these days.
So before we move on to the whole question of Manhattan's legacy, his impact, I'm kind of curious, did any of his predictions actually pan out? Did this New World Order he talked about, flawed as it might have been, did any of it actually come to pass? So did Manhattan's vision of the future, his New World Order, did it ever come to pass?
Well, it's complicated. History, rarely unfolds in a straight line.
Yeah.
And the future Manhattan envisioned, well, it was always going to be messy, full of contradictions.
Okay, so maybe no flying cars or world peace, but were there any aspects of his vision that, actually gained traction? Did any of his predictions hit the mark?
Let's put it this way. Some of the trends he identified, the anxieties he tapped into, they're still with us today, even amplified in some ways. The debate about the role of religion in public life, the push and pull of globalization, the increasing reliance on technology to solve complex problems, those were all central to his worldview.
It's like he had his finger on the pulse of something big, even if the specifics of his vision didn't fully materialize.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying someone like Manhattan so valuable. Even if we disagree with his methods or conclusions, he forces us to confront these enduring questions, these tensions that continue to shape the world long after he's gone.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the forces, the ideas that still influence us today.
Absolutely. And in a world bombarded with information where everyone seems to have an agenda, that understanding is more important than ever.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind? What can Avro Manhattan's story teach us about navigating this complex world of information and influence?
First and foremost, be wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers. Remember, even those fighting for seemingly noble causes can have agendas that might not align with your own.
It's like that saying, don't be so quick to follow someone who's already lost their way. We have to think for ourselves, question everything.
Exactly. Dig deeper, consult multiple sources, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Don't just accept information at face value, even, and maybe especially, if it confirms what you already believe.
Precisely. Look for those hidden agendas, those subtle attempts to manipulate or mislead. It's easy to get swept up in a compelling narrative, especially when it aligns with our preconceptions.
It's like Manhattan himself showed us. Sometimes the most alluring stories, the ones that promise simple solutions to complex problems, those are the ones we need to examine most closely.
Well said. Ultimately, engaging with history, even controversial figures like Avro Manhattan, is about sharpening our own critical thinking skills. It's about learning to ask the right questions, to see through the spin, and to form our own conclusions based on evidence and careful consideration.
So as you continue exploring the topics that fascinated Manhattan global politics, the role of religion, the power of ideas, remember his story, his methods, and the complex legacy he left behind.
Let it be a reminder that truth is rarely black and white, and that unpacking the past is an ongoing process, one that requires vigilance, a healthy dose of skepticism, and an unquenchable thirst for understanding.
Beautifully put. And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the enigmatic world of Avro Manhattan.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, and never stop diving deep.